In this video, I'll explain the impact of shares, limits, and reservations on virtual machine performance, and we'll also talk about some misconfigured reservations and what the impact of those might be. So here we see an ESXi host, and this ESXi host is equipped with 48 gigabytes of memory. And if we go about creating virtual machines with reservations, what we're going to do is guarantee a VM a specific allocation of a physical resource. So for example, here we see VM1. VM1 has been configured with 2 gigs of memory. That means at any given moment, this virtual machine can consume a maximum of 2 gigabytes of memory. But we've also given it a 1 gig memory reservation. So what is the impact of that memory reservation? Well, when we grant a VM a memory reservation and we power that VM on, it immediately consumes those resources from the ESXi host. So now the ESXi host has 47 gigabytes of memory remaining that can be shared by all of the other running virtual machines on that host. The moment I create that VM with a 1 gig reservation, that memory is gone. That virtual machine is going to consume that memory all the time, even when it doesn't need it. And if I create a second virtual machine, let's say with 2 gigs of memory allocated, but in this case I gave it a 1.5 gigabyte memory limit, that means that that virtual machine will never be allowed to consume more than 1.5 gigabytes of memory. So reservations and limits are really hard and fast rules. They're not flexible. They don't adjust. They are hard, fast rules that cannot be violated. So in this case, VM1 is going to be guaranteed 1 gig of memory. Now, what if the host can't satisfy a memory reservation or a CPU reservation? So let's say VM1 is currently powered off and the ESXi host doesn't have enough available memory to guarantee 1 gig to VM1. Well, you won't be able to boot that virtual machine up. If a virtual machine's reservation cannot be satisfied, you will not be able to boot up that virtual machine. And you'll see an error that says something along the lines of admission control error. When you see an admission control error, the majority of the time, the problem is a misconfigured reservation. Shares are different. Shares don't introduce as much potential for problems. And shares are very flexible. So for example, here we have those 2 virtual machines again, VM1, VM2. And VM1 is configured with 2 gigs of memory. VM2 is also configured with 2 gigs of memory, but they have different share values. And shares are used to define relative priority. So one of the great things about shares is the fact that shares are only enforced if there's an actual shortage of available resources. So under normal circumstances, VM1 and VM2 are going to operate exactly the same. They'll both get as much of their 2 gigs of memory as they need, and they'll perform well. But if the ESXi host doesn't have enough memory available, well, in that case, VM2 is actually entitled to twice as much memory as VM1 because VM2 has twice as many shares. And that's what we call an entitlement. VM1 may be configured with 2 gigs of memory, but that doesn't mean it's entitled to 2 gigs of memory. So in this case, we can see our host actually only has 2 gigs of memory available to distribute across these 2 virtual machines. So in that case, neither VM1 or VM2 are going to be able to get access to the full allocated 2 gigs of memory that they've been created with. And it'll break down kind of like this. VM1 will be entitled to 0.67 gigabytes of memory. VM2 will be entitled to 1.33 gigabytes of memory. And that's due to the share structure that we've created. And I like to think of these shares sort of like a safety net. Most of the time, if I'm a tightrope walker, I'm not going to use the safety net. That's the ideal scenario. We don't want the safety net to be used. But if I ever do need it, I'm going to be glad that it's there. That's kind of what shares are like. Under normal circumstances, these share values that we've assigned to VM1 and VM2 don't have any bearing on the performance of those virtual machines. However, when there is a shortage of resources. These shares ensure that my most important virtual machine, VM2, gets the lion's share of the resources during that shortage.